For months, whispers inside Buckingham Palace had warned of growing cracks behind the gilded doors. But no one expected the storm to break like this. In a moment that would echo through royal history, King Charles finally uttered the words many believed he'd never dare say, "Enough is enough." With that, he set in motion a quiet but seismic shift that would strip Camilla of her unchecked influence and elevate Catherine into a destiny once considered untouchable. Behind the grandeur and ceremony, a battle for control was reaching its boiling point. What had once been subtle tensions hidden beneath smiles and formalities was now spilling into the open, setting the stage for one of the most defining moments of Charles's reign. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The tension had been building slowly, almost imperceptibly, through endless meetings and ceremonial decisions. Charles, known for his measured temperament, had begun to bristle at the growing control exerted by Camilla's inner circle. At first, their influence had seemed harmless, merely suggestions about communications, strategy, or event planning. But over time, the subtle nudges became direct interventions. Speeches were edited without his final approval. Invitations were extended and rescinded by people who answered not to the king, but to Camilla. Senior courtiers began to notice the shift. Conversations that once centered on preserving royal tradition were increasingly steered toward promoting Camilla's vision of the monarchy, a vision that quietly, but unmistakably, placed her influence at its heart. Meanwhile, Catherine, graceful, steady, and widely admired, found herself increasingly sidelined from key ceremonial decisions. Events that traditionally highlighted the future of the monarchy were curated to keep her role symbolic rather than substantive. Behind closed doors, invitations were redirected, speaking opportunities reassigned, and appearances subtly reduced. To the public, it appeared smooth and unified. But within palace walls, frustration grew. Catherine's supporters among senior courtiers watched with dismay as the woman many believed represented the monarchy's future was gently but firmly pushed toward the background. Even William, usually cautious about palace politics, began to sense the deliberate nature of these moves. Charles's frustration was no secret to those closest to him. Though he often maintained a public calm, in private he expressed unease over Camilla's assertive political maneuvering. What had begun as a partnership was evolving into a competition for influence. Some insiders described it as two courts forming within one palace, one loyal to the king's vision, the other loyal to Camilla's ambitions. Each decision, no matter how small, seemed to carry hidden meaning. Seating charts became political statements. Public appearances became subtle tests of dominance. Amid this growing turbulence, Charles began holding quiet meetings with Princess Anne. The two shared a deep understanding of royal tradition, and Anne had long harboured doubts about Camilla's expanding influence. These private conversations, often late in the evening, signalled something was shifting. Courtiers noticed the change. Anne's presence at strategy discussions grew more frequent, and her counsel carried greater weight. Speculation began to swirl. Was the king preparing to pivot? Was he slowly gathering allies for a decisive move? Outside the palace, public sentiment was mounting. The people's eyes had always been drawn to Catherine, her poise, her dignity, and the way she seemed to embody the continuity of the crown. Editorials, opinion polls, and televised commentary increasingly called for a return to a traditional, Catherine-centred monarchy. Her popularity soared, while Camilla's remained polarising. Pressure on Charles grew with every passing month. Courtiers whispered that the king was caught between two powerful forces: personal loyalty to his wife and his duty to the crown's enduring image. And then, the breaking point arrived. In a high-stakes strategy session at Clarence House, what began as a routine discussion about upcoming ceremonial appearances erupted into an explosive confrontation. Camilla's advisors presented plans that sidelined Catherine from a major royal initiative, positioning Camilla instead as the central figure. For Charles, it was too much. Voices were raised, accusations levelled, and years of suppressed frustration finally broke free. Those present would later describe the moment as unlike anything they had ever witnessed in royal planning rooms. Charles's voice cut through the chaos with a decisive clarity. He made it unmistakably clear that the balance of power would shift and that he would no longer tolerate actions that undermined the monarchy's future. But what led to this extraordinary moment wasn't just a single argument. It was years of simmering resentment, secret alliances, and a battle for the very soul of the monarchy. And deep within the palace walls, Camilla's growing shadow was about to be exposed in ways no one could have imagined. Camilla's rise was never accidental. Behind every public smile and polished appearance was a carefully constructed network that allowed her voice to echo in every corner of royal power. She understood that influence within the monarchy wasn't seized with a single bold act. It was accumulated, step by step, through the strategic placement of loyal allies. Over time, her circle began to expand quietly, weaving itself into the king's communication teams, event planners, and senior advisors. What began as subtle guidance soon evolved into a structure that operated almost parallel to Charles's own authority. Decisions that once passed through him now often had her imprint before they ever reached his desk. And while this shift was invisible to the public, inside the palace, it was impossible to ignore. Her influence extended beyond personnel. Ceremonial events, often symbolic battlegrounds for royal hierarchy, became the stage for her growing shadow. Seating arrangements, once determined by rigid tradition, began to subtly reflect her priorities. Key positions during televised events were rearranged. Her allies ensured she was placed prominently, shaping how the public perceived the monarchy's internal dynamics. Behind these choices were media strategists who worked to craft narratives, positioning her not as a supporting figure, but as a central pillar of modern royal life. Press statements mirrored her tone. Headlines began to shift, and slowly but unmistakably, her family's presence was brought closer to the institution's core, blurring the lines between personal ties and royal legacy. Not everyone welcomed this transformation. Princess Anne, known for her fierce loyalty to tradition, grew increasingly uneasy. She recognized the implications. Camilla's maneuvers were not mere preferences. They were a rewriting of the unspoken royal order. Tension between them simmered beneath formal politeness. Anne, with her sharp instinct for court politics, sensed that Camilla's growing network could one day overshadow not only her, but the future of the monarchy itself. Behind closed doors, their exchanges were said to be curt, even cold. Each understood the stakes, but neither would openly declare battle not yet. William and Catherine, too, began encountering friction. Plans for future royal projects, meant to shape the next era of the monarchy, were often rerouted or diluted through Camilla's channels. Initiatives intended to spotlight the younger generation were delayed or overshadowed by unexpected priority events favouring her causes. William, usually measured, reportedly found himself in quiet but firm disagreements with Camilla's advisors, while Catherine endured these manoeuvres with characteristic grace, even as she felt their weight. It wasn't simply about appearances, it was about the shifting centre of gravity within the royal household. The media, ever attuned to subtle changes, began noticing unusual patterns. Official statements seemed inconsistent, as though competing narratives were being pushed from within. Headlines speculated on dual messaging emerging from palace communications. Commentators pointed out how certain stories were emphasized while others were buried. Insiders understood what this meant. Camilla's unseen hand was guiding the public narrative, often steering it in directions that benefited her position, her allies, and her family's proximity to the crown. For Charles, this shadow grew larger with each passing month. Out of loyalty, and perhaps a desire to avoid confrontation, he had long tolerated it. But even the most carefully constructed networks have fault lines. A series of missteps and overreaches would soon transform this growing unease into something far more decisive, a turning point he could no longer ignore. It was supposed to be a flawless display of unity, a living symbol of continuity. Trooping the colour, the grand celebration of royal tradition, was meant to project harmony, stability, and an unshakable image of a family united under the crown. But this year, a single, calculated maneuver would shatter that illusion. What unfolded on the Buckingham Palace balcony exposed a fracture that could no longer be ignored. Senior royals were left stunned, courtiers scrambled to contain the fallout, and the press seized on every detail. For King Charles, this wasn't idle palace gossip anymore. It was public, humiliating, and impossible to reverse. Behind the polished ceremonial facade, a quiet power struggle was unfolding. According to insiders, Charles had personally approved the balcony positioning plan weeks in advance, a careful arrangement meant to reflect both tradition and the monarchy's future. William and Catherine were to stand prominently, signalling continuity and their central role in the evolving royal narrative. But at the 11th hour, Camilla allegedly intervened. Against Charles's wishes, her advisors proposed a new formation that subtly shifted the spotlight. William and Catherine were moved further down the line, their position diminished just enough to alter the visual hierarchy. To the public, it might have seemed like a small detail, but within royal circles, it was a direct challenge to the king's authority and a calculated show of her growing influence. The consequences were immediate and explosive. As the family appeared on the balcony, global media outlets noted the awkward body language. Observers picked up on the subtle tension that words could not mask. Catherine, ever composed, maintained her graceful silence. But those watching closely saw the contrast. Her quiet dignity set against Camilla's assertive presence. Commentators began speculating in real time, their voices filling newsrooms and social media with questions about who truly held sway within the palace. For an institution built on image, this was devastating. Charles's fury was not loud, but it was unmistakable. During the post-ceremony luncheon, whispers circulated among aides of a rare outburst. The king's frustration at being undermined in such a public and symbolic setting rippled through the room. Those close to him described his demeanour as controlled but icy, a clear signal that his patience had reached its limit. What made the moment even more volatile was the quiet but firm involvement of Princess Anne. Known for her bluntness, she reportedly confronted Camilla in a brief but pointed exchange witnessed by several staff members. It wasn't just Charles who had noticed the overreach. Anne, too, saw the balance of power shifting in dangerous ways. And then, as if on cue, palace aides began leaking hints to trusted journalists. Carefully chosen phrases like "the last straw" and "unprecedented defiance" began appearing in insider reports. These weren't random leaks, they were warnings. The message was clear. A line had been crossed. Public reaction followed swiftly. Commentators and ordinary citizens alike expressed outrage that Catherine, the future queen consort in the eyes of millions, had been pushed into the background. Newspapers called for her to be placed where she belongs, while polls showed a sharp swing in public sentiment toward her. What seemed like a ceremonial misstep was, in truth, the spark that ignited the king's long-suppressed resolve to reclaim control. And behind the palace doors, alliances were already forming, alliances that would soon set the stage for a midnight pact that would change everything. As the palace slept under a moonlit sky, two figures walked the quiet halls of Windsor in whispered conversation. Princess Anne and Prince William, unlikely co-strategists separated by a generation but united by purpose, were laying the groundwork for something few had ever dared attempt, a deliberate realignment of royal power. This was no idle late-night discussion. It was the birth of a pact, shadowy, calculated, and destined to alter the course of the monarchy. Away from cameras, courtiers, and the ever-watchful press, the two carved out a strategy that would embolden Charles to act and thrust Catherine toward the position Camilla had quietly tried to obstruct. Anne's frustrations had been simmering for months. She had watched Camilla's informal influence grow unchecked, embedding itself in palace machinery like roots beneath ancient stone. For someone as steeped in tradition as Anne, this creeping power grab was intolerable. She had dedicated her life to upholding the monarchy's structure, its rituals, and its unwritten codes of hierarchy. To see that structure subtly rewritten through backroom maneuvering struck at her core. Her conversations with Charles had grown increasingly pointed, each laced with reminders of what their mother had built and what was now at risk. William, meanwhile, had reached his own breaking point. He had long observed how Catherine's symbolic role was being diminished, not through blatant exclusion, but through a series of careful sidesteps designed to keep her in the background. Each alteration in public positioning, each subtle messaging shift, sent the same signal. Catherine was being contained. For a man raised to embody the monarchy's future, this was both personal and political. He understood that Catherine's image wasn't just popular, it was vital. She represented stability, continuity, and the bridge between a fading past and an uncertain future. Their shared concern was simple but urgent. If Camilla's shadow continued to grow, it would distort the very image the monarchy depended on to survive. So, in secret, they began crafting a plan. The goal was not confrontation, but recalibration, a quiet but firm repositioning of Catherine at the heart of the royal narrative. They met privately in tucked-away rooms, often under the guise of informal family catch-ups, to outline the steps. It wasn't about speeches or grand gestures yet. It was about influence, shifting conversations, guiding decisions, making sure when the moment came, the ground was already prepared. Anne's role was crucial. She had the gravitas, the respect, and a direct line to Charles's conscience. No one else could remind him so powerfully of their mother's legacy. She began dropping carefully chosen words in conversations, invoking the Queen's sense of duty, her ability to prioritize the crown over personal loyalties. These reminders weren't confrontational, they were surgical. They made Charles think and rethink his tolerance of Camilla's growing reach. Meanwhile, William focused on aligning key figures in the palace who understood Catherine's value to the Blythe institution's future. Together, Anne and William agreed on a single, unwavering commitment. When the time came, they would publicly and unmistakably back Catherine. No more quiet sidelining, no more passive acceptance. Their alliance was quiet but formidable, rooted not in ego, but in a shared vision of what the monarchy must become to endure. And when that moment came, it wouldn't be a whisper in a hallway, it would be a royal thunderclap. Days later, a sealed letter arrived on Charles's desk, its wax stamp instantly recognizable. The moment he saw it, he knew this wasn't routine correspondence. It came from the highest constitutional advisors, men and women whose counsel had quietly shaped royal decisions for generations. Its contents were brief, but devastating. Within those pages lay a dossier of internal missteps, strategic warnings, and a piercing analysis of the palace's current trajectory. And at the heart of it all, one name hovered like a shadow: Camilla. For Charles, this was no longer personal. It was institutional, and the author of that letter was someone whose judgment he had never ignored. The advisors didn't mince words. They warned of destabilizing optics taking root within the royal household. Decisions once perceived as ceremonial missteps were now being interpreted as structural fractures. They outlined how internal rivalries were spilling subtly into public life, creating a dangerous image of division. For a monarchy that survived on perception, this was perilous. The letter detailed specific examples of Camilla's oversteps, the balcony incident, strategic staff placements, and her growing influence over communications. Each was presented not as a rumor, but as a pattern, carefully documented and impossible to dismiss. The warning was clear. Public trust was eroding. If Catherine, widely seen as the future embodiment of the crown, continued to be symbolically sidelined, the institution risked alienating its most loyal supporters. Opinion polls were shifting, media narratives were sharpening. The letter laid bare what few dared say aloud, that Camilla's growing shadow was no longer merely a private irritant. It was becoming a constitutional liability. The advisors didn't stop there. They drew historical parallels that struck a nerve. Instances from royal history were invoked, moments when royal spouses had overreached and destabilized the monarchy's carefully balanced image. Each example carried an unspoken implication. History was repeating itself. For a man as steeped in royal legacy as Charles, these reminders were powerful. They evoked his mother's cautious wisdom, her ability to maintain the institution's stability by never letting personal dynamics cloud the crown's image. As he read, a storm gathered inside him. Charles found himself torn between loyalty and legacy. On one hand, Camilla was his partner, someone he had defended against public skepticism for decades. On the other, the monarchy he had waited his entire life to lead was being quietly reshaped under her influence in ways he could no longer control. Those close to him would later say this was the first moment his hesitation visibly cracked. The king, who had long preferred to manage tensions quietly, was beginning to see that inaction carried its own costs. The letter's final paragraphs held the most pointed suggestion. Without issuing a direct command, the advisers subtly proposed that elevating Catherine's role could serve as a stabilizing force. Her image, they argued, had become synonymous with continuity and trust. By formally positioning her at the heart of royal operations, Charles could not only restore balance but also reaffirm the crown's unbroken line into the future. In that quiet study, as the weight of the letter settled over him, Charles's hesitation began to crumble, and a decisive, historic move took shape. Far from London's gaze, inside Balmoral's ancient stone walls, a rare gathering took place. This was no ceremonial family reunion, no polite exchange over royal affairs. It was a council secret, deliberate, and unlike anything the monarchy had convened in years. Senior royals, trusted aides, and Charles himself assembled behind locked doors to confront what could no longer be ignored. There were no cameras, no official records, just raw, unfiltered discussions that would determine the monarchy's direction for decades to come. By the time the meeting ended, Camilla's once formidable influence would stand on the brink of dismantling, and Catherine's quiet rise would be given formal shape. Charles had summoned Anne and William personally. He chose Balmoral deliberately, away from prying eyes and the press's insatiable appetite for palace intrigue. Here, in the heart of royal tradition, he could speak without the suffocating weight of optics. As the council began, what emerged was not rehearsed diplomacy, but a candid airing of grievances and fears. The topic on everyone's mind was the same. Camilla's unchecked influence had reached a point where it was no longer sustainable. What had once been tolerated out of personal loyalty was now threatening to distort the monarchy's public image. William spoke first, his voice measured but firm. He laid out his concerns with precision, drawing from months of accumulated frustration. Catherine, he argued, had been reduced to a symbolic figurehead when she should have been the embodiment of the monarchy's future. Every strategic sidelining, every shift in narrative, had weakened the public's perception of stability. His advocacy wasn't just personal, it was institutional. He made clear that if the monarchy wished to survive in the modern era, Catherine's role had to reflect the central place she held in the hearts of the people. Anne followed, her words cutting through the tension with the bluntness only she could wield. She reminded Charles of their mother's legacy, not through flowery praise, but through sharp contrast. Queen Elizabeth had ruled not by overpowering those around her, but by embodying quiet, unquestionable strength. She never allowed personal dynamics to cloud the crown's image. Anne's message was unmistakable. Charles could not afford to let sentimentality dictate the future. Camilla's growing shadow was not only unsustainable, it was fundamentally incompatible with the monarchy's core identity. The advisers then stepped forward with their analyses, presenting a series of scenarios for how the public might react to a formal shift. They had studied the mood of the nation, examined media trends, and weighed potential fallout. Their conclusion was unanimous. The public would embrace Catherine's elevation. Her image was one of stability and continuity. She wasn't simply admired, she was trusted. Stripping Camilla's influence, they argued, didn't need to be done with spectacle. It could be quiet, deliberate, and decisive, the kind of move that appeared natural, even inevitable, once executed. Charles listened intently. He asked questions, challenged assumptions, but the writing on the wall was becoming impossible to deny. This was no longer a matter of if, but how. After hours of tense debate, a clear agreement emerged. Camilla's informal network would be quietly dismantled. Her control over key ceremonial and communication matters would be reduced step by step, leaving no obvious fault lines for the press to exploit. At the same time, Catherine's role would be elevated strategically and publicly endorsed, positioning her as the future's steady anchor. But even as they reached this unprecedented consensus, one question loomed like a storm on the horizon. How could they execute such a delicate shift without igniting a media firestorm, or worse, a palace war? While the palace machinations swirled around her, Catherine remained outwardly composed, her silence more powerful than any statement. She had always understood that in the royal world, power was often wielded not through loud proclamations, but through quiet endurance. Behind closed doors, however, something was shifting. She was being prepared, carefully and deliberately, for a new era, one that would demand not only her trademark grace, but a level of strength and resilience few could imagine. For years, she had stood patiently in the shadow, supporting, observing, waiting. Now, her moment was coming, and she understood the weight it carried. Anne was one of the first to take her into confidence. Their conversations were discreet, almost ceremonial in their precision. Anne, ever pragmatic, began briefing Catherine on the delicate political landscape taking shape behind palace walls. She spoke plainly about the growing strategy to reposition Catherine at the heart of the monarchy's future. Senior advisers joined these briefings, offering insight not as courtiers but as loyal guardians of the crown. They emphasized that this transition would not be announced with fanfare. It would unfold through subtle signals, deliberate positioning, and the careful dismantling of the competing influence that had grown unchecked. Catherine listened intently. She did not interrupt, nor did she flinch at the magnitude of what was being placed on her shoulders. In private, the conversations with William took on a more emotional tone. He knew better than anyone the pressures that awaited her. Together, they spoke openly about the challenges ahead, the scrutiny, the symbolism, the delicate balance between family and institution. William reassured her that this was not merely the palace's will, it was his firm belief that her presence, her steadiness, was essential for what was coming. Catherine, in her quiet way, acknowledged that the time for hesitation had passed. This was no longer about personal comfort. It was about stepping into a role history had been quietly reserving for her. Strategists within the palace began planning her next moves with military-like precision. Every public appearance was evaluated not for spectacle, but for symbolism. How she stood, who she stood beside, which causes she highlighted. Each event was designed to signal, without ever needing to declare that Catherine was no longer simply part of the royal narrative. She was the narrative. Loyal palace aides rallied around her, sensing that her rise was not merely a tactical decision, but a necessary course correction. Her quiet strength, long admired by the public, became their anchor amid the swirling uncertainty. But not everyone was blind to these changes. Camilla, long accustomed to having the upper hand behind palace doors, began to sense the subtle shift in the air. According to insiders, she confronted Charles in private, questioning the increasingly visible support surrounding Catherine. What had once been whispers was now a movement. Tension began to build beneath the surface of normal royal routines, as if the palace itself was holding its breath before an inevitable storm. And then, as autumn leaves began to fall over Windsor, the king made his move not with whispers, but with thunder. The moment arrived without warning. In a televised address that stunned the nation, Charles abandoned vague pleasantries for firm, uncompromising words. "Enough is enough," he declared. "It is time to safeguard the monarchy's future." His voice carried the weight of history and the sharp edge of finality. With that statement, he publicly reaffirmed Catherine's place at the very heart of the crown, a deliberate, calculated move that stripped Camilla's influence in a single sweeping gesture. The palace had spoken. The era of ambiguity was over, and the world was watching. Charles framed the address as a moment of stabilization. He spoke of duty, continuity, and the need for the monarchy to reflect the values and expectations of the nation it served. It wasn't just a statement, it was a line drawn in stone. Without naming names, he left no doubt about the direction he intended to take. References to a renewed focus on the future and those who embody the enduring strength of the crown made Catherine's elevation unmistakable. For years, her position had been strategically understated. Now, it was declared in front of millions with regal finality. The impact on Camilla's public role was subtle but devastating. The wording was careful, but the undertone was clear. Her presence would no longer shape the monarchy's direction. No formal demotion was announced, yet those skilled at reading royal signals understood the message immediately. Certain ceremonial responsibilities were redefined. Future plans were framed around Catherine's leadership in key initiatives. Camilla's influence, once woven into the palace's inner workings, was suddenly absent from the narrative. It was a quiet, sidelining the kind that speaks louder than any explicit decree. Inside Camilla's circle, shockwaves were immediate. Advisors who had once spoken with confidence suddenly found themselves sidelined from briefings. Invitations that had always been assumed were now reconsidered. Meetings were cancelled, phone calls went unanswered, and an air of uncertainty settled over the network she had so carefully built. To some, it felt like the rug had been pulled out overnight. To others, it was the inevitable result of overreach meeting resistance. Either way, it was clear. A new power structure had emerged. The global media reacted with a frenzy rarely seen in modern royal history. Headlines called it a palace power shift, while commentators dissected every phrase, every inflection, every historical parallel. Footage of Catherine in recent months, once interpreted as routine, was now re-examined as foreshadowing. Analysts compared Charles's tone to pivotal moments in royal history, when monarchs had intervened to preserve their institution. For the first time in years, the narrative wasn't about division. It was about a bold public reassertion of the crown's future. Public reaction was overwhelmingly in Catherine's favour. Messages of support flooded social media. Opinion pieces praised her as the embodiment of modern royal dignity, and polls reflected a sharp surge in approval for the royal family. People who had grown skeptical began to speak of renewed faith. For many, it wasn't just about one woman's rise, it was about clarity after years of quiet, internal tug-of-war. But while the world celebrated Catherine's ascension, the palace corridors buzzed with whispers. Camilla's silence was not submission. She was not retreating quietly. In the aftermath, Camilla found herself isolated, her carefully built network unraveling almost overnight. The shift was swift, almost surgical. People who had once pledged unwavering loyalty began to step back, sensing the changing winds within the palace. Former allies avoided direct confrontation but quietly distanced themselves, unwilling to attach their futures to a fading source of influence. Public sentiment, once divided, now tilted sharply against her. Headlines that had previously balanced praise and critique turned cold. She wasn't just losing power, she was losing the narrative, and for the first time, Camilla faced the monarchy not as a partner in power, but as an outsider looking in. Her withdrawal was quiet but visible. Engagements that had been regular fixtures on her calendar were quietly reduced. Invitations that once carried her signature presence were suddenly represented by other senior royals. At first, this retreat was explained as a matter of scheduling, but those within palace circles knew better. This was the calculated peeling back of influence, the systematic dismantling of a network that had once seemed untouchable. Behind palace doors, resignations began to ripple through the staff most closely aligned with her. Long-time aides requested transfers. Communications figures who had championed her causes were reassigned to new roles. One by one, the pillars that had supported her informal power structure were removed. Meanwhile, Catherine stepped into her new role with the quiet authority of someone who had waited years for this moment. Her first major ceremonial act in her elevated position wasn't just symbolic, it was decisive. She carried it out with precision, signalling both to the public and to the institution that this was not a temporary adjustment, but a new reality. Loyal aides, strategists, and senior royals rallied around her, sensing the stability and clarity she brought to the role. Where Camilla's influence had often felt like a force working behind the scenes, Catherine's presence was open, measured, and unifying. William and Anne watched this transition unfold with silent satisfaction. Their pact, forged in quiet corridors months earlier, had succeeded in reshaping the monarchy's internal balance. Neither sought public credit, their victory was never meant to be loud. Instead, they stood firmly behind Catherine, ensuring the palace's new direction held steady. The institution, long weighed down by internal rivalries and blurred lines, now had a clear centre of gravity. For Charles, the moment was bittersweet. There was relief in finally asserting control and aligning the monarchy with its future, but it came at a personal cost. Camilla's retreat was not just political, it carried emotional weight. She had been his companion through decades of turbulence, and watching her influence fade stirred a complex mix of sadness and determination. Yet his duty to the crown prevailed. His decision to elevate Catherine wasn't just about strategy, it was about survival. And yet, beneath the triumph, a subtle unease lingered. The corridors of power are rarely silent for long. Camilla may have been sidelined, but her story within the monarchy was not necessarily over. Power rarely disappears. It shifts, it waits, it recalibrates. Foreshadowing of future tensions hung in the air like a quiet echo, a reminder that no royal victory is ever absolute. As the palace gates closed each night, one thing was certain: the crown had chosen its future, and Catherine now stood at its centre. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.